gratitude, thankfulness, wanting to say thank you from the heart is definitely a virtue. Again, I want to always clarify, a virtue is not an act. A virtue is a power within you that makes it possible for you to do something good, just as a vice is not a sin. A vice is a power within you that makes it possible for you to do something bad. Please forgive me in advance for this example on Thanksgiving Day, but if you find that in your life you will constantly be tempted by that fourth piece of pumpkin pie, please know that the temptation in and of itself is not a sin. In fact, resisting the temptation is a good deed. So with virtues, a tendency to do something good is not yet anything done. Seeing a person hungry on the street, thinking good thoughts about them, having warm, fuzzy feelings about them, and saying to yourself, gee, wouldn't it be nice if someone gave that person something to eat, is as good as nothing. So that's a virtue. Well, nevertheless, virtues are something that we need to develop because we'll never do anything good without first developing the power to do something good, the ability, the tendency, the force within us. In the classical short lists of virtues, thanksgiving, gratitude is not on there. It's because in the Middle Ages, they viewed gratitude as what the medieval theologians called a complex virtue. It is a combination of virtues. In fact, St. Thomas Aquinas wrote that gratitude, he said, thanksgiving is the highest development of religion. Because in order to be grateful, you have to combine a sense of awe and wonder toward God, the fear of God, a deeply rooted humility, an awareness of reality, and a piety which desires justice on this earth. You put them all together and you get gratitude. Thus, said St. Thomas Aquinas, gratitude, he called it the axle on which all the virtues rotate, the hinge on which all the virtues turn, the virtue which takes religion and turns it into holiness. The difference, he said, between hollow, meaningless religious observance and saintliness is that hinge which is gratitude. It helps us turn the whole thing into something that is meaningful and real. One of my favorite authors when I was in high school was Flannery O'Connor, a wonderful Catholic author from Savannah, Georgia. I like her partly because when I was in high school and college, I had absolutely no idea what any of her stories were about. I read them over and over again, and they were deeply fascinating. Never could figure any of them out. They just confused me, and maybe I was a glutton for punishment. I thought, that was so confusing, I'm going to read it again. She's got a story called Ring of Fire. She wrote it in the mid-1950s about a woman named Mrs. Cope, which I finally figured out, it's a code word, because Mrs. Cope thinks she can cope with anything. She prides herself in her gratitude. She's always giving thanks to God. No matter what happens, she gives thanks to God and wants everyone else to give thanks to God. And at first, you think she's a virtuous person, a good person. Bit by bit, the author, Flannery O'Connor, reveals that the woman is not virtuous at all because there's some important ingredients missing in her form of gratitude. She every morning gives thanks for her house, left to her by her dear departed husband. Gives thanks to God that even in her sorrow at being a widow, she was able to overcome that sorrow and lives now grateful for the years she had together with her husband, with my husband, she said. She's grateful for the farm he left her. She gives thanks to God for the many, many people who work the farm that she refers to as my field hands, my employees, my people. She seems generous and good. She helps a lot of poor young people who she refers to, as my boys, my girls. The word my appears about 8 or 10 times on every page of that story. She drives some people crazy. One of her friends complained one day that she's in terrible pain because she says, I have 4 cavities at the same time, and it's horrible. And Mrs. Cope said, you shouldn't complain. You should give thanks to God that it's not 5 cavities. And so on with everything in her life, always telling other people, you're not grateful enough. That's the trouble with you. You're not grateful enough. Look at me. Look at all I've suffered. And I'm always grateful until one day 2 homeless teenage boys knocked on her door and asked for help. And she put together some food from some leftovers and gave it to the boys, who immediately grabbed it and ran over to where the woods began and began to eat ravenously because they hadn't eaten in a long time. And she yelled at them and said, don't you have any gratitude? You didn't even say thank you? Said, you come here to my house and take my food, and then you just run off into my woods and eat it? And the boys start making fun of her, and one says to the other, Lord, she thinks she owns the woods. She thinks she's greater than God. She probably thinks she owns the sky above her house. And then he yells at her and says, I ain't yours. And the woods ain't yours. And the sky ain't yours. We belongs to God. And when I say grace, I give thanks to God and not to the high and mighty lady. And she returned some other choice words, and this is where, the teachers sometimes wish that Flannery O'Connor used a more ladylike language, because there were some there were words I didn't even know when I was in the 9th grade, let me tell you. They swear back and forth, and the boys that night, they're so mad at her, they set the woods on fire. The story is called Ring of Fire. They set the woods on fire, and it burns like a ring around her house. And all these ancient Georgia oaks and Georgia sycamores become stumps and ashes. And Mrs. Cope stares at the destruction, heartbroken, with pain in her face. And Flannery O'Connor writes, as she looked upon the destruction with pain, her face could have been the face of anyone. Could have been the face of one of her field hands. Could have been the face of one of the poor Russians sent to the gulag that she was always complaining about. Could have been the face of one of the boys who took her food and lit her woods on fire. And in her suffering, for the first time, she discovered that gratitude either leads you to connect with other people, or it is not gratitude at all. It is pride. It is suffering that turns pride into thanksgiving. And only in her suffering did she finally become one with the people she called my people, my workers, my children, my poor people, my clients, the ones grateful to me. Only in that ring of fire, wrote Flannery O'Connor, did she become like Naaman the general. We heard that in that first reading. She became like Naaman the general, who was used to commanding other people, and healed of a great disease by the prophet Elijah. His first response, his instinct, was to show how great he was and offer to make Elijah rich and famous and powerful, until he realized that gratitude means grasping the dirt and falling on your knees and knowing, from dirt am I come, to dirt I return. Praise and glory to God, who made me out of the very dirt of the earth. Only as she stood in the ring of fire did she finally become a leper. Again, Flannery O'Connor had a weird way of looking at the world. She said, it's like the time that Jesus punished the 10 lepers by healing them. Because as long as they were lepers together, they were just 10 men, comrades in agony, viewing each other as equals, with love, with respect. But when they were cured, suddenly they became 9 Jews and 1 Samaritan. Suddenly they became 2 religions, 2 nationalities, 2 languages, 2 cultures. Suddenly they became 9 natives and 1 foreigner. And cured of their suffering. Within a day they had degenerated, she wrote, into cruel men who kicked the foreigner out. You know, I read that story probably in the year 1975. I still haven't figured it out, so I can't tell you what it means in the end, and I don't know how to end this sermon because I'm still reading that stupid story. I read it again last week, and it's still just as confusing. I know she's on to something. It is in our humility, born even of suffering. It is in our realization that we come from the earth and belong to the earth, that the sky is not ours, the water not ours, the land not ours, nothing ours. That we can be grateful and not proud of our own accomplishments and the things we own. To give thanks to God for what is ours is not thanksgiving at all, but a way of bragging to God. To acknowledge to God that all is God's and we are but His stewards. That is the beginning of thankfulness.